Hello everyone and welcome to the first Relo Andes webinar of the new year. For those of you unfamiliar with the Relo office, Relo is Regional English Language Office. We are coming to you from the United States Embassy in Lima, Peru. The Relo office is in charge of all things having to do with English language programming, particularly teacher training, which is the idea of this webinar, in case you're unfamiliar with Relo Andes webinars. So to begin, my name is Maggie Steingraeber. I am an English language fellow who is based here in Lima, Peru. I host and coordinate the webinars, so you'll see me each month helping you through the webinars and helping the presenters. Also, if you have questions on webinars and you respond to the email that you received, I'll be the one to respond to it, so please don't hesitate to contact me. All right, today's presenter is me. So if you joined us last month, you'll know that we had a different presenter. We had to do a quick change, but it was rescheduled. So the webinar from Roger on authentic materials will take place, but we'll do it next month. I will give you all of the information for that at the very end of the webinar on time and place for that. So I'll be doing today's webinar. Just real quick about me, as I said earlier, I am an English language fellow who is based here in Lima, Peru. I've been here for about a year and a half. My primary responsibilities are working with the Ministry of Education in the areas of initial teacher training and with the COARs, which are high performance high schools. I specialize in teacher training, curriculum development, and also educational technology. So today's webinar, the topic is going to be how to build reading skills through storytelling. So just from the title alone, something that stands out is that this is going to be an integrated skills approach to teaching reading. Because not only are you going to be learning about reading stories and building reading skills through stories, but also telling stories, either orally or in writing. So we'll begin with just some quick goals on the webinar so you know what you've gotten yourselves into. The participants will, first I want you to experience and reflect on a sample reading lesson. So I'll run you through a demonstration reading lesson and ask you to think about the experience and reflect on how it was and how it could be used in your own classrooms. We'll differentiate between different stages of a reading lesson and how you can structure your own reading lessons, and gain tools and strategies for implementing well-structured reading lessons in your own classrooms. There's two different types of reading lessons. I'll say that there's extensive and intensive. Extensive focuses on reading fluency and just having readers read a lot for the sake of reading. This is going to focus on an intensive reading lesson, which will give you an example of how to take one text and look very closely at it. So we'll begin with the demonstration lesson. So for the next 20 minutes or so, you will be my students and I will run you through a reading lesson. So like I said before, we're going to be talking about stories. Stories come in a lot of different ways. So first I want to take a quick poll just to learn from you guys, what is your favorite way to experience a story? There's many different ways. Stories can be movies, TVs, books, comics, theater, oral storytelling. So we'll do a quick poll on the screen and just let us know, what is your favorite way to experience a story? All right, about 60% of people have voted. Again, this is a poll. You can just click right on your screen for which is your favorite way to experience a story. And you can only choose one this time. We're making you choose a favorite. All right, we'll leave it open for another 3, 2, 1, and close. All right, well, the favorite way to experience a story for most of you was 49% of you like movies and TV, followed by 30% who like to read books, 5% comics, 5% theater, and 11% like oral storytelling. Great. All right, thank you for that. So I have another question for you just about stories. For this one, you can just type it into the chat box just so that we can see it because it's a long poll. What is your favorite kind of story? And this one, just type into the chat box. We won't do a poll, and I'll read out some of the answers. Do you like comedy, funny movies, romance, or movies or TV or books or anything? Comedy, romance, horror, drama, science fiction, animation, action, adventure. What is your favorite type of story? If you could hear any story or watch any movie, which one would you choose? I see a lot of romance. Romance and science fiction. All right. Right, okay. Horror and drama. Choosing two. Okay, perfect. All right, comedy. Something that's based on real events, like a drama. Very good. Science fiction, action, adventure. Excellent. Okay. And science fiction. Okay, so now we're thinking about different types of stories, and I'm sure at this point a lot of you have in your mind about maybe a favorite movie or a favorite book that you have. So at this point you're starting to think about different kinds of stories and different stories you like and possibly a favorite. So there's different parts of a story that I want to go over. We're going to read a story, but before we do, I just want to go over some vocabulary that is helpful in order to understand how stories work. I've identified 5 different elements of a story, and we'll see if you can match them. Again, you can just type right into your chat box. So 5 different elements are character, setting, plot, conflict, and resolution. Let's see if you can match the definitions to it. So first off, if I say character, what am I referring to? Am I referring to the time and place of action, the problem that needs to be resolved, the individuals that the story is about, the solution to the problem, or the events of the story? All right. Getting a lot of answers, a lot of C's. What about 2? What is the setting? When I say setting, what do I refer to? All right, a lot of you skipped the answers. Good. So we'll go through this quickly because I'm sure a lot of you as teachers already know the answers, but we have the characters are the individuals the story is about. The setting is the time and the place. So not only the physical place, but also the time, if it takes place in the future, if it happened in the past, if it's current time. Next is the plot. The plot are the events of the story. So what the story is actually about. The conflict is the problem. And the resolution, which is how the problem is solved. So those are all good vocabulary words to know about when you talk about a story. All right, then we have parts of a story. So if you've seen something like this, if you're familiar with the word genre and having to do with text, genre is the basic structure of a text. So a story looks like this. It follows this arc structure. If you've seen a recipe, you know that the genre of a recipe always has the ingredients and then in order steps in how to make the dish. So for this one, there are 4 different parts of a story: resolution, introduction, climax, rising action. With students, you could have them label it and talk about the different parts. Us being teachers, I'm sure we're already aware of it, so we'll go through it quickly. Your introduction is the part of the story where you introduce the characters and the setting, and part of what the basic plot is going to be about. The rising action is the part of the story where the plot develops. So that's what the story is about. The rising action builds up as you see it rise, hence rising action, to a climax. The climax is the turning point of the story. It is where all of the rising action becomes something. It's where everything changes. And the resolution is the ending. Could be a happy ending, could be a sad ending, but there's some end to the story. All right. So now we're going to look at a story. I'm going to show you the cover of a book or a movie poster, however you want to look at this. And I'm going to ask you to read the title and look at the picture and make a prediction about what kind of story you think it'll be. So do you think it's a comedy? Do you think it's action adventure? Do you think it's a horror story, crime, romance? What kind of story do you think it's going to be? So the holiday to sunny Paracas. And you can see the picture. You could ask students to identify things that they see in the picture: palm tree, umbrellas, beach. So looking at this picture, what kind of story do you think that this is going to be? I see a lot of romance. Someone says adventure. Roger says comedy. Maybe an adventure. All right, adventure. A lot of people think adventure. Great. Okay. A lot of people coming up with adventure. We have another romance. Someone thinks the word sunny sounds funny, which yes, it kind of does. All right. So just so you know, just so you're aware, the words that are in capital letters, like predict, are all reading skills. They're all different strategies that students can use or that you can teach students to use when you're going through a reading lesson. So prediction, for example, requires, if when you ask students to predict, you give them just a little bit of information and you ask them to use their critical thinking skills to apply what they already know to something that's unknown. So they've never read this story, but they know from the picture and the words, they might get an idea of what it could be. So they're starting to apply their knowledge and make guesses about things. This also gets students more interested in reading the story because they'll want to see if their predictions are correct. So we'll get to the story. So we looked at the cover and we predicted what we thought it was going to be about. Next, I want you to scan. I'm going to show you the text and I want you to scan it. Just scan it for characters and setting. Remember, characters are the people, who it's about, and the setting is the place. So who's in the story and where does it take place? Scan is another reading skill that you can have students practice. When you scan a text, you look at a text very quickly. So I'm going to show you the story, but I'm only going to give you 1 minute. 1 minute is not enough time for you to read every word of the story. Instead, you're supposed to scan it, which means reading very quickly for specific information. So don't read every word. Only look for names of people and places and times. All right. So you'll have 1 minute. I'm going to time it on my clock. I'll show you the text, and then I'm going to take it away. So don't spend time reading the whole story. Only read for characters and setting. Thirty more seconds. And time. So from the scan, let's talk characters first. Who are the characters that you saw? Oh, a lot of you already have it. You have Miguel, Sharon, and Pablo, an evil director. Exactly. Yep. So 3 characters. Yeah, a lot of you found it. Good. And again, with your students, you can adjust the time. If you think if it's a longer text and they need more than a minute, give them 2 minutes. If they're very fast readers and it's a short text, 30 seconds. All right, so 3 characters, we found them. Where does it take place? There's 2 places that were mentioned in this story. Lima, there we go, Luis got Lima, and Paracas. Good, Lisette got Paracas. Good, so 2 places. Excellent. All right, now we're going to practice another reading skill. This one is skimming. So skimming is similar to scanning, but when you skim, you read very quickly, but you're looking for a general idea. Instead of specific information, which was scanning, you're going to skim. So you're going to read quickly and just ask yourself at the end, what's the main idea? So again, I'll show you the text. This time we'll do a little shorter. We'll only do about 40 seconds because you've already seen it. I'll show you the text again, skim it, read very quickly, and try to tell me in 5 words or less, what's the story about? What's the main idea? About 15 more seconds. And time. All right. So in the chat box, if you can tell me, try to do it in 5 words or less, but something short, just a sentence maybe. What's the story about? What's the main idea? It could be a single word, it could be 2 words, it could be 1 sentence. Don't tell me the whole story, but just tell me what's the main idea. All right. Lucia says a man who will fight for the woman of his life. Miguel falls in love with Sharon. Very simple. Perfect. Miguel falls in love with Sharon in Paracas. Exactly. A teacher loves an English teacher. Exactly. Yep. Perfect. Yeah. So a lot of you found it. That's exactly it. It's a story about, as many of you have predicted, romance. So a lot of you predicted an action-adventure story. But from seeing this, you're able to check your prediction and see that it is actually a romance story. Yeah, love in Paracas, a man who falls in love. Love at first sight. Yeah, exactly. So just a very quick idea of what it's about. So if this were a class with students and we had more time, I would then go back to the story and have students read in depth. This way they could check their predictions, check their understanding, ask questions. We'll go over some other skills at the end that students can do in order to be active readers. Since this is just a half-hour webinar, we don't have as much time to do it, but in this case, I would have you read it and then create. So create is the word that you see capitalized here. It is taking it the next step, so not just reading, but expanding on it. And again, we'll go through some of the different parts of a reading lesson and what I mean by create. So you see from this, and I can show you where I got this story from, it ends in a question mark. It's just a blurb, it's just an idea of a story. It's not a full story. Because you remember from the elements of a story, the story has to have an introduction, rising action, climax, resolution. There are only half of the story is here. We have the introduction and we see some rising action, but you can see that there's no climax, there's no turning point. We don't know what all the action leads up to, and we also don't know how it ends. So if you were going to make a prediction on how it ends, that's something that you could have the students create. Creating a resolution and coming up with some ending to it and giving them the power to choose how the story ends, happy, sad, whatever it would be. All right, so the website that I used is called Plot Generator. It is here. I can show it to you in a moment. We'll see if I can pull it up. Here it is. So this is a website that you can choose either to generate an entire story or just a movie script. There's a lot of similar websites like this out there. If you just put into Google plot generator, you'll see a lot. But it's helpful for writing stories. And if you're familiar with how Mad Libs works, it's very similar to that. And also, if you're going to be doing some focus on story structure, it's also helpful to be talking about those elements of a story that we already talked about and different types of stories. So, for example, the story that you read was generated as a romance. You could choose a different kind. Ask your students what kind of story they like. Maybe they like crime stories. So you can click on crime story, and there you're given a lot of good vocabulary for them to fill out. So you have to put in a name. They could put in a name of a friend or a classmate. Their relationships, so things like friend, mother, brother, sister. Adjectives, positive adjectives, negative adjectives, places, objects, locations. So they're putting in the words, and they get some, so there, we can fill it out randomly if we don't have time like how we are now, or have your students fill it out. And it will write you a story, including the name, the title, everything for it. So the students will read it and they can see how their words are being applied to a particular story. So this is one example of how you can get your students involved in writing the story. If in your class, if in your schools you don't have, you don't have access to the internet or a computer lab, not everyone can be in a computer. I'll give you a low-tech option in a minute that you could look at. But again, remember that's just a blurb. There's 2 parts missing. It only goes to rising action. So you would have to ask your students to finish the story. So not only are they reading the story, but then they take it the next step to finish it. And they'd have to be sure to include characters, setting, plot, conflict, resolution, and making sure that the story has a very clear beginning, middle, end, which are those 4 parts that we looked at earlier. So again, plot generator is just one option. There's a lot out there that you can look at, and there's a lot of different options for generating stories. You can also write your own story and make it personal. But if you want to get students involved, that's one way. The low-tech option that I told you about is just an idea too for low-tech. On a piece of paper, ask your students to number from 1 to 10 on a piece of paper. I'm sure you're familiar with this activity, where each student writes 1 line of the story. So have students write 1 to 10. One student writes 1 line of the story and then passes the paper to the person next to them, who has to read that line and complete it. And the story continues, so that each time the story is passed, the student has to read and then expand on it. Always remember that when you're teaching reading, any kind of text is reading. So even if they're reading something that they wrote, or something that's fun, or something that seems silly, it's still reading. So it's still good practice. And one suggestion that I give for this low-tech option, a lot of times when you do these stories, you end up with things that are a bit nonsense because there's no structure given to it. But when you talk about the story structure, as I discussed earlier, and you let students know about how stories develop, you can give them a little structure with it so that they're sure to follow it. So have the students number 1 to 10 on their paper. Ask the first 2 students to be in charge of writing the introduction. The next 5 students should be keeping in mind rising action. So making sure that there's a sequence of events that are building on each other. Student number 8 would be in charge of the climax, the turning point. So student number 8 job would be to read everything and change it. And the final 2 students who get that paper would be in charge of the ending. And then with this, you could also be teaching different story words, common introductions for stories like once upon a time. There once lived who lived in a haven't fill in the blanks. Resolutions, endings, happily ever after, those kinds of phrases and story vocabulary and story terminology that they have probably seen or are likely to see if they ever read stories in English that are part of the genre. So looking at teaching reading through one specific genre can really focus on the structure and having them understand how stories develop and where they come from. So to review what we did in the demo lesson. First, we started with a story discussion, and I asked you questions on what kinds of stories you like and how you like to experience stories. You could ask people to talk about their favorite story. Next, we looked at story structure. So what goes into a story? What are elements of a story? What are parts of a story? How stories build and how they develop. That provides students with a little knowledge of structure and genre. We did a little previewing and prediction where I showed you a picture and a title and asked you to make guesses. Then we did targeted reading where I showed you a text and asked you to look for very specific parts of the text. Instead of just giving someone a story and saying, here, read it, it's read it, but look for this. And finally, there was the expansion activity, which we didn't do, but I showed you how it could be done, which is asking students to complete the story, to expand on it, to give it an ending. So that is an excellent way to think about how to structure a reading lesson. And again, I'll say this structure could be used not only for reading, but also for any kind of text. Could also be used for listening. Many times teachers look for a lot of different texts that they can use, and they want to use as many different examples in one class as possible. When it's much more, it provides a much more solid structure for students to focus intensely on one text instead of look at a lot, but really focus on one and make sure that they understand it and that they really go deep into that text. And again, I'll go through at the end on differences between extensive and intensive readings that have different purposes. But this would be an example of an intensive reading lesson where you're looking more intensively at just one text. So you always want to start a class with a warm-up. A warm-up, as you can see, for a lot of teachers, especially in EFL settings, students haven't spoken English in sometimes a week, in a long time, so you need to just get their brains thinking in English again. So the purpose of a warm-up is a very fast activity, 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the most, that's just fun and is intended to relax the students and introduce the topic so that they can see or they can understand what topic they're going to be talking about or discussing or reading about for the remainder of the class time. The next phase of a reading lesson is pre-reading. Before you give students a text, you want to make sure that they're ready for the text. So in a pre-reading activity, you would select some new vocabulary that you might not know about, and that you think the students might not know about, and get them to understand the new vocabulary. You can also activate schema at this point. Schema is background knowledge. So your students are not coming in to your class with empty brains. They have an entire life of experience. They have read other stories. They have gone to other classes. They have a lot of rich, valuable experience behind them. So use that. See what students already know about the topic that you're going to be discussing, and create some kind of discussion or some activities to see what they already know. So in the pre-reading, you're getting them ready to read through seeing what they know and activating any new vocabulary. Next is during reading. And I see a lot of you say that you already do that, and that's great. So to keep it going. During reading is, like I said before, you don't just want to give students a text and say, here, read this. but give them some focus. Give them, like I said before, targeted reading. Make sure that they're engaging with the text and interacting with the text in some way, be it skimming or scanning, maybe filling in a blank, making some kind of connection. But having reading, making sure that the reading has a purpose. They're reading for something. And finally, the post-reading. So once they finish reading, that isn't the end of the lesson. That's the end of the reading. So from there, for the post-reading, you want to, of course, make sure that they understand it, answer any questions, clarify any doubts, ensure that the reading was understood. And finally, expand on the content. So that's where you take it to that expansion idea. Have them take what they read, take the topic they discussed, whatever it be. It could be a story, it could be a recipe, it could be a news article, it could be a research article, depending on their level, a brochure, anything. But expand on it. Have them take what they did and do something with it, so that it doesn't just end at the reading. So those are the 4 different parts of a reading lesson. And this structure can take you through one class. You could structure this throughout a unit over several classes. It's up to you. You as the teacher have the freedom to decide how long these things are going to take and how much time you want to spend on each. This could spread out over several classes and turn into a project, depending on the expansion activity. If there's some grammar structures that are new in the reading, you can cover those in the pre-reading too, and tie in a little grammar, tie in some vocabulary, give some structure to it, but all the whole time keeping in mind that you're preparing them for this reading. And like I said before, again, I'll repeat, this could also be reused for listening. If you have a listening text, it's the same structure. So finally, we talked about a bunch of different reading strategies that I just want to review very quickly just to make sure that you understand them. First is previewing. These are some reading strategies and some skills that you can work on with your students. It's not an exhaustive list. There are more out there, but these are some key ones that are helpful for building strong readers. And they're things that you can practice with the students or ask them to do on their own, get them in the habit of. First is previewing, where you just overview the reading. You're not looking too in-depth at it, you're just looking at the topic. If you have a book, maybe you're just looking at the front cover or reading the back cover. A movie, maybe you look at the preview, the trailer, just to get an idea in general what the topic's going to be. Next is prediction. So asking people to guess what happens. Take that background knowledge, that schema that we talked about before, and ask them from what they already know to make a prediction about what they think is going to happen. And as I said before, this is also very helpful in getting students invested in the reading, because they'll be reading in hopes of checking, were my predictions correct? So it gives them a little focus when they're doing the reading. Inferring meaning is understanding through context. So getting them in the habit of not reading a text with a dictionary next to them and looking up every single word that they don't understand. Instead, look through, have them read the text, and if they don't understand a word, try to guess what it means. What's the idea? What's the main thought there? If they still are really stuck and it's helping them, it's hurting them in the overall comprehension, last step could be to go to a dictionary to ask for a translation. But strong readers can infer meaning through context, get the main idea without understanding every single word throughout it. Visualize is another reading strategy. This is a great strategy to practice with stories in particular, because stories have characters, they have settings, there's action going on in it, and that's creating a mental picture. So as students are reading the story, ask them what the characters look like. So you read the story with Miguel and Sharon and the evil director. Asking them to tell you, what do these people look like? What clothes are they wearing? What color is their hair? An activity could be, if you want to keep expanding, having them, from the text, create a comic book, for example, where they are visualizing what does Paracas look like? What does crowded Lima look like? What do the teachers look like? What is happening in all of this? So visualizing it gets them in a habit of reading and having that mental image going through their mind. And it also helps them to see if they can't create that mental image, then maybe there's a misunderstanding, maybe there's a problem in comprehension. And that helps keep them on track in terms of, am I understanding the story? Also interesting to compare between students on how one student visualizes a character versus another. Making connections. So asking them to connect the story to the real world. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you heard a story similar to this? But taking the reading from just beyond that text that they're looking at and into something that they know of, something that is in the world around them. Asking questions. So this is getting students to think critically about the text. And these can be questions that a lot of teachers overlook because they seem so simple, but asking students, did you like the story? What did you think about the story? How could the story be different? But getting them to think about their opinions and question certain things. Why do you think this character did that? If the character had done something else differently, how could it change the ending? But getting them to think beyond just the words on the page and apply their own thinking to the story, be it their opinion, changing, improvements, things they liked, didn't like, anything of the sort. And summary. Summary is also an important reading strategy of kind of like what I showed you with the skimming. Asking them to read it and tell you in their own words what happened in it. Don't tell me every word, tell me in one sentence. It's a big skill that's often is challenging to students who, when you ask them to summarize it, will start reading the text back to you, and that's not what you asked. You want to know what the main idea was. So those are just a few different reading strategies. There's more out there, but these are some key ones that apply particularly well to stories and storytelling and making sure that you understand the story. So last thing before I can take some questions are just some tips for teachers on how to implement this kind of lesson structure into teaching stories. First is drawing students' attention to genre and structure. So that first part that I did in the beginning, where you're talking about elements of a story and parts of a story. Not to overlook that part, because it's something that if you know you're going to be focusing on stories, you can make students aware of how stories work. It helps them with prediction, it helps them with their own writing, and it also gives them something to pay attention to when they're reading. If you go back to that chart that I had with the arrows, you could ask students to write into a chart like that what happened in each of these settings. Allowing students the freedom to read and write stories of personal interest. So with the plot generator website that I showed you, asking them, which story do you want to read? Which story do you want to write? Maybe giving them an option of 3 different stories that you like and saying, which one do you want to read? There's so many stories out there from around the whole world of all different topics, all different lengths, for all different proficiency levels and interests. Let the students choose which one they want to read so that they're interested in it. The thing with stories is people like stories. And when you let people choose a story they like, they're actually going to want to read it. Versus when you give them a text and just ask them to read, they might not be interested in it. But when it's a story and they like it and they're invested in the characters, they will want to keep reading. And finally, providing plenty of opportunities for practice and strengthening skills. So not just giving them a story and saying read it, but practicing the skills that I had showed you here with some different strategies, giving them opportunities to practice more than once So don't just do this reading lesson once and say, there, I taught it. These are skills. They need to be practiced. And it may be difficult for students the first time, but the more they do it, the stronger readers they'll become, and the more complex you can make the texts. All right. So with that, we'll see, are there any questions from people or comments on readings? So you can type into the chat box any questions that you have, any thoughts that you had on reading. All right, we have one from Maria from a while back on, is it possible to do it in 2 classes of 2 hours each? And yeah, like I had said before, that structure is just a very basic outline that could be done in 1 class. Or this could be the plan that you follow for an entire unit. You could spell this out over days. So you could start the class doing some pre-reading work on structure and topic. And then the homework, for example, could be to read. And then you come into class and you talk about the reading and do an expansion project or assignment on it. So that's just an example off the top of my head of how you could structure it over 2 classes. You could spread it out over days. You could do it in 1. It's up to you as the teacher. You know your students better. You know your schedule better. So it's up to you on what you think works best for your students, and also taking into consideration the complexity of the text, of the story, the length, and your students' interest as well. All right. All right, we have another one from Roger on, is it possible to use these strategies with real beginner students? And yeah, absolutely, of course you can. The factor that you can change is the text itself. So this structure was given with stories, but you could use this structure with anything else, with any other kind of text. So it's that idea of focusing on one text and really digging in deep with that one text instead of giving students a lot of different readings to do. But the idea is comprehension. So if it's real beginners, take something that's very short, maybe like 2 or 3 sentences, and make sure that they understand it. Stories can be as long or as short as you want them to be. And it doesn't even have to be a story. It could be an idea. It could be a quote. Again, with real beginners, something that might be good would be comics, because comics also include pictures that help give them some visual clues. And the words, the actual text, tends to be shorter and more concise and could be easier phrases. So something you could look at is just altering the text. It's whatever text you would use with readers. With your real beginners, you could use, but just really spending more time on understanding the text. What kind of questions from Mary? What kind of questions could I use to activate schema? It depends on the topic. Remember, schema is background knowledge. So let's take this text that I gave you, for example, on the romance story. You could ask students about their experience of falling in love. Have you ever had a summer romance before? Have you ever seen a movie about a summer romance? What happened? How did it end? What do you think about it? It's all about just asking them about their experience. And it could be on any topic. So let's say you're going to read a story about space exploration. You could ask them, what do you know about outer space? Have you ever studied it before? Have you read a story about it before? But just seeing what they already know, because your students already have seen things, most likely. They've already read stories. They've already studied it in other classes. It may not have studied it in your class or in English, but that doesn't mean that they haven't seen it before. It's not totally new information to them. Let's see. What else do we have? Is it a good technique to memorize parts of the reading? I think you'd have to ask yourself before you ask students to memorize a part of a reading on what the purpose of memorizing that text is. Just memorizing for the sake of memorizing, I don't see where that would lead, because there's not a lot of times in your real life where you're going to be asked to read a story, memorize it, and recite it back. If they're doing an activity, if there's something that's really important to memorize, you could use it. I would say, in answer to memorization of parts of a story or memorizing a story, I would say thinking about why, what is that leading to? What's the benefit with it? Memorizing the vocabulary of what parts of a story are, I think, is beneficial, because those are more generalizable skills that can be applied to other stories. So if you read one story and you teach them the parts of it, and then you read another story, you can take those skills that you taught them in the first one and have them apply it to the second. And that way they can compare two different stories that may be seemingly different but follow the same structure, or maybe have the same characters, or have the same ending, or something like that. It's easier for comparing and contrasting. Could you share with us links where stories have different levels? Offhand, I'll try to think of some. There are some that you can look at for different leveled stories. If you respond to me in an email, I can get you some links that I can think of. Offhand, I think it's just a matter of taking stories that you like, or asking students what stories they like. And if you read a story and it seems very difficult, you can simplify it or make it more complex. In terms of finding things that are made for learners of different levels, I'd have to do a little research on things that are written for a specific level. Your opinion on the Think Aloud protocol? With that, I believe you're referring to the thinking out to yourself with other people around. I think it's a great way to get students to speak, because again, like I said in the beginning, this is an integrated skills approach to teaching reading. So ultimately, you're teaching a reading lesson, but through the expansion activity, you're also either writing a story for storytelling, or speaking it if you want to have them do oral storytelling, or even if you want them to have them do a role play with a skit, then they're practicing speaking skills. So if you do a Think Aloud protocol where you're asking them to maybe read the story and be thinking out loud about what they're visualizing, or thinking, why did the character do that? If I had been that character, I would have done something else. I think it's a great way to get them questioning things and speaking and thinking, and they might have an idea that one person hadn't thought about, but through the Think Aloud protocol, they thought about it because of a different classmate. So yeah, I support the idea. I think it's a great protocol to have, as long as it fits into your classroom and whatever it is that you're doing in your lesson. Okay, Umberto has a question on what's more important, the content or the form of the story. I think both are important. I think that kind of goes back to that idea of what's more important, fluency or accuracy. And the answer is that both are important. It's about finding a balance. You need to be able, if you're reading a story, you need to understand the content. If you don't understand the content, then there's no point in reading the story, because that's what it is. You're trying to understand the story, the events, the characters, step into someone else's life for a moment. And in that sense, the content is very important. The form is also important, though, too, because it helps students to understand how the story is structured. So in terms of which is more important, I think it's about the balance between the two. Let's see. Let's say topics. There's one from Carlos that's about changing the topics And again, the structure that I gave you for the reading skills can be applied to any text, either written or spoken. And that means any topic. So for this particular presentation, I focused on stories. But you could replicate the same structure looking at a newspaper article, looking at a cooking recipe, looking at a research article, looking at a comic book, looking at anything on any topic. So if there's a certain topic in your class that you're trying to cover, you can still follow this structure and still apply these strategies and skills, and they still work just as well. So the benefit of this type of structure is that it's adaptable. You can adapt it to your topic, to your text, to whatever skill you're trying to work on. What if students need to read a whole novel? Yeah, so I think I touched on this very briefly before, that there's two different types of reading lessons. One is intensive and the other is extensive. When you do an extensive reading, you are focusing on reading fluency. It's about reading quantity and just having students become comfortable with the text and reading for reading. When you do an intensive lesson, it's a short text that you are focusing intensively on for the purpose of practicing these skills and really looking at comprehension. So you could, usually with a whole novel, you would do something more extensive, and it's something that you wouldn't take class time for necessarily. You could, depending on how you structure your class, but reading is something that's usually very internal and individual. So when you do an extensive reading, you would maybe give your students a homework assignment to read a chapter, or give them 15 minutes to just read or something like that, but it's something that's usually quiet time and they can do on their own, and they're just reading for the sake of reading, for the practice of it, which is it's a completely valid skill, and it's very helpful and beneficial, but different focus. If you're going to do a whole novel and you want to follow some of these strategies, I would break it down. So maybe not have them read the whole novel and then analyze it as a whole, because especially when the novel's so long, they might have forgotten things that happened in the beginning by the time they get to the end. So maybe break it down by chunks into maybe one chapter, depending on how long the chapters are. Maybe really analyzing one chapter at a time, or two chapters at a time, or three chapters at a time, or sometimes books are broken into parts. You could look at it in terms of parts. But if you want to follow this structure, it's really more intended for short or shorter readings that you can really look at and analyze as a whole. And for children's classes, the reading structure and keeping their attention span higher. Yeah, so with children's classes, again, like I said, this is adaptable. So you would obviously want to choose a text or a story that's appropriate for the students. And in terms of making sure that they're attentive to it, that would be where you use some of those skills of having them visualize, having them draw what they're writing, the think aloud protocol, which we talked about before, of having them talk out what they're thinking, but making sure that they're active, making sure that they are interacting with the text, make sure that it's a text that in terms of language is appropriate for them, so that it's not too complex, too advanced, too difficult, and also in terms of topic and content. Make sure it's something they're interested in. You're not going to have your primary students reading War and Peace or reading articles from the New York Times, for example. So making sure that's appropriate both in level and in topic, and including in a lot of what I had said before of just making sure that they're active and engaged with it. All right. We're about out of time, so I'll just take a couple more. One from Carlos on, can I create stories related to projects? Yeah, absolutely. So like I had said before, you could take this and have that expansion activity, that post-reading activity, extend into a project So if they're reading a story about the rainforest, you could expand that out into a project where they are making a campaign, or where they're making a brochure, where they're doing a project, where they're taking action. With a story, you could do projects where they have to rewrite the story in terms of the perspective of a different character. So like Little Red Riding Hood, for example. They could read the story from the perspective of Little Red Riding Hood. And then as an assignment, they could have to rewrite the story, but from the perspective of the wolf. So it gets them thinking about a different perspective, a different way to visualize it, a different way of seeing the story, where they're writing it. They have to read the story and understand it, and then they have to write it and expand on it. And that writing can take a while. And even with that writing, you could then ask them to act it out, to role play it, to make a video. Students now have cell phones that can create videos. So ask them to make videos, edit the videos, which students really get into with, and the technology is pretty accessible. So asking them for that expansion activity can be as long or as short as you have time for. All right. All right. Yeah, I think we are just about out of time, so we'll leave it at that for now. Like I said, next month, this is the webinar that we had to reschedule. So Roger from Trujillo, Peru is going to present his webinar, but he'll do it next month. The topic is using authentic materials in the classroom. It will be on Wednesday, February 22nd from 3 to 4 p.m. That is Peru time. So it'll be the same time, but on Wednesday the 22nd. So thank you for joining us. If you want more information on Relo Andes or on our webinars or any other events you have, you can contact us through the email reloandes@state.gov. Like I said before, if you want to contact me directly, the email that you got for confirming your registration goes to me, so you could reply to that and I will get it as well. You can connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, all of the webinars are recorded, and we upload the recorded version to YouTube. So if you go on YouTube and you search Relo Andes webinars, you will be able to see the recorded version of this presentation and any of the other webinars that we have done previously. So if you did not get a chance to download the handout, or you want to go back over something, you can find it on YouTube. So thank you for joining us this week or this month, and we hope to see you again on the 22nd. Thank you. Bye.